Good evening, or perhaps good morning. Whatever time it is for you, welcome. We've made it through another day. Let's begin this slow journey across the first waves ever crossed by humankind. Look at that. Big, isn't it? Wet too. And frankly, for about 99.9% of human history, it was the ultimate keep-out sign. A terrifying, unknowable void. Monsters lived there. Storms could swallow you whole. Getting lost wasn't just embarrassing, it was terminal. The horizon wasn't an invitation, it was a threat. Here be dragons wasn't just a doodle on a map, it was a reasonable health and safety warning. So why? Why would any sane ancestor of ours look at this liquid death trap and think, you know what, I fancy a paddle. Maybe see what's over there. Especially when over there could quite literally be the edge of the world, guarded by something with too many teeth and bad breath. Imagine packing for this trip. No Gore-Tex, no satellite phone, no all-you-can-eat buffet, just you, maybe a few relatives you're not entirely sure you like, some dried fish that tastes vaguely of disappointment, a spear that seems woefully inadequate against a 40-foot sea serpent, and a boat made of, well, whatever wasn't nailed down. Reeds, logs, a suspiciously buoyant cousin? It wasn't exactly the Titanic, more like the Titanic's embarrassing, slightly leaky ancestor. But they did it. Against all apparent logic, prehistoric landlubbers became master mariners. They didn't just hug the coast like sensible people. They pointed their questionable crafts into the deep blue yonder. They crossed distances that would make a modern sailor check their insurance policy twice. They found islands smaller than your average shopping mall, scattered like cosmic breadcrumbs across thousands of miles of empty ocean. They did it tens of thousands of years before Columbus got seasick, before the Vikings perfected the art of looking terrifying in a boat, before anyone had even invented the compass. This is the real age of exploration. Forget gold-plated galleons. This was the age of hold my fermented coconut drink and watch this. It was the ultimate gamble, driven by hunger, curiosity, overcrowding, maybe a misplaced bet, or simply the desperate human need to see what's over the next hill, even when the hill is a 20-foot wave and the next is potentially oblivion. This story isn't about one great man in a fancy hat. It's about countless generations of forgotten heroes and heroines, the ultimate early adopters. They weren't conquistadors, they were colonists, refugees, explorers, and families looking for a better beach. They developed technologies so ingenious, we're still figuring them out. They learned to read the language of the ocean, the stars, the waves, the birds, the very feel of the water, like we read text messages. They mapped the planet with their courage and, occasionally, their floating remains. So buckle up your metaphorical life vest. We're casting off the lines of modern certainty and sailing back into a world of myth, mystery, and staggering human audacity. Prepare for storms, questionable fashion choices, probably involving loincloths and lots of salt crust, revolutionary inventions born of necessity, and the kind of navigation that makes GPS look like cheating. We're going to meet the original sea monkeys and discover how their leap into the blue made our world possible. So, why cast off into the terrifying blue? Well, sometimes the universe gives you a rather forceful nudge, or more accurately, a global-scale flood. This was the real deluge, happening in agonizingly slow motion over thousands of years. As the last ice age whimpered to an end, all that frozen water decided to go for a swim, raising global sea levels by over 120 meters. Imagine your daily commute getting progressively wetter. Your favorite mammoth hunting ground, now a lagoon. Grandma's cave, beachfront property, then underwater real estate. This was the fate of Sunderland. Vast stretches of continent swallowed by the rising Java Sea and South China Sea. Populations found themselves marooned on shrinking islands, watching the water inch closer every generation. The message was clear: adapt or swim. Or perhaps build something that floats. Of course, necessity wasn't the only mother of this particular invention. There was also lunch. Coastal resources became crucial. Shellfish beds, shallow water fish. But fish are notoriously inconsiderate tenants. They move. Following seasonal migrations meant venturing further, maybe losing sight of the comforting lump of rock you called home for a while. The original surf and turf was really just surf, and it had a tendency to leg it. The pull was strong, reefs exploding with life just offshore. Big, delicious pelagic fish tantalizingly out of reach beyond the breakers. Curiosity is a powerful human trait. What's over there? Is that just a weird cloud, or is it land? Could there be more shellfish? Fewer saber-toothed, whatever those things were, less annoying in-laws? The horizon wasn't just a barrier, it became a question mark, and humans, bless our restless brains, are terrible at ignoring question marks. Then there's the ancient equivalent of looking at your overcrowded apartment, your dwindling fridge, your neighbour who insists on practicing the world's first and worst drum solo at 3 a.m, and thinking, you know what? The open ocean suddenly looks quite appealing. Overpopulation, resource stress, maybe a spot of intertribal unpleasantness. The sea became the ultimate escape valve. The original refugees weren't crossing borders, they were casting off lines. What's worse than your neighbour's barking dire wolf? Your neighbour, period. Sometimes the risk of being swallowed by a leviathan seemed preferable to another family feast with Uncle Grog and his questionable opinions on cave painting techniques. Adventure often starts as desperation with better scenery. And let's not forget the role of sheer, dumb luck. Or bad luck, depending on your perspective. Storms. Those terrifying acts of aquatic rage that still make seasoned sailors queasy. Imagine one hitting your flimsy coastal fishing raft. 1 minute you're contemplating dinner, the next you're a human ping-pong ball in Neptune's washing machine, spat out into the vast, trackless blue. Survival against the odds became accidental exploration. You weren't navigating. You were clinging on and praying the current was feeling charitable. The original wrong turn. Honey, I think we passed the mammoth hunting grounds. By several 100 miles. On the plus side, I think I see a palm tree. Columbus gets credit for discovering the Americas. Please. He was following a trail of breadcrumbs left by generations of storm-tossed, incredibly lost, but remarkably resilient accidental tourists. So it wasn't one reason. It was a perfect storm-tossed cocktail. The push of rising seas and crowded shores, the pull of abundant resources and burning curiosity, and the wild card of getting spectacularly blown off course. We see the evidence in the archaeology, the spread of distinctive tools, pottery styles like the intricate lapita, and crucially in our own genes. It tells a story not of a single exodus, but of countless journeys, planned migrations, fishing trips that went long, families seeking breathing room, storm survivors making landfall on paradise, or another cramped island. They became the ultimate real estate agents, specialising in remote fixer-upper islands, stunning ocean views, occasional volcanic activity. The why was survival, opportunity, and an irrepressible human itch to see what's next. The how, that required something almost as miraculous as the journey itself. It required turning trees, reeds, vines, and sheer ingenuity into a vessel that could defy the ocean's fury. It required building a boat. Okay, motivation sorted. Survival instinct, check. Irrational curiosity, check. Annoying neighbours, double check. Now for the hard part, building your ticket out of here. Forget shipyards and CAD software. This was bush engineering at its most audacious. The brief? Make something that floats, hopefully carries us and some snacks, and doesn't immediately dissolve or get eaten by something larger than itself. No pressure. Step 1. The humble raft. Nature's prefab flotation device. See reeds? Bundle them tight. See logs? Lash them together. Simple. Effective-ish. Think of them as the minivans of the ancient aquatic world. Practical, spacious-ish. Not exactly built for speed or rough weather. Papyrus in Egypt, totora in South America, bamboo across Asia. If it floated and you could tie it together, it was fair game. The Papyrus-class explorer had a draft so shallow you could probably scrape your knee on the seabed, perfect for Nile deltas or coastal lagoons. Open ocean. Let's just say it demanded a certain fatalistic optimism. Waterproofing was more of a guideline than a rule. Watertight meant you'll only get moderately soggy, not instantly sink. Progress. Enter the game changer, the dugout canoe. Take one enormous tree trunk. Now spend weeks, maybe months, burning and scraping out the middle. Sounds tedious? Absolutely. But the result? A proper hull. Suddenly, you have something that cuts through the water, not just wallows on top of it. More stable, faster, could handle bigger waves. It was a global lightbulb moment, appearing independently from the Amazon to the Arctic. This wasn't just a raft, it was a boat. A heavy, slightly tippy boat that took forever to build, but a boat nonetheless. Suddenly, that horizon looked a little less intimidating, or perhaps just invitingly further away. But the true revolution, the leap from floating log to vessel capable of crossing oceans, came with stitching, not clothes. Boats. Sewn plank construction. Imagine this. You carefully shape wooden planks. Instead of nails, which were either non-existent or precious metal, you sew them together edge to edge with incredibly strong cordage, twisted vines, animal sinew, later sophisticated palm fibre rope. Then you jam every gap with waterproofing gunk. Moss, tar-like bitumen, sticky tree resins. It sounds insane. Like building a wardrobe out of matchsticks and dental floss and expecting it to survive a hurricane. But it worked. Spectacularly well. The genius was in the flexibility. Nailed or pegged boats are rigid. Hit a big wave. Crack. Sewn boats could flex. They twisted and bent with the sea, absorbing punishment that would shatter a rigid hull. Ancient maritime duct tape and bubblegum, holding together vessels that dared the world's biggest pond. Oman, India, Southeast Asia. This was the cutting-edge tech of its day, millennia before the Vikings. Now paddling or rowing across a lake is one thing. Crossing an ocean? That's a muscle-powered nightmare. Enter sail power, harnessing the free fuel. Early sails were likely simple squares or perhaps rigged animal skins, great for catching a following wind down the Nile or across the Mediterranean. But they had a fatal flaw. They were terrible if the wind wasn't blowing directly from behind. You became a weather vane with a passenger manifest. Then came the revolution, likely born in the island labyrinths of Southeast Asia among the Austronesian ancestors, the fore and aft rig. Think triangular sails, the lateen sail, the incredible crab claw sail. These weren't just wind catchers, they were airfoils, like an airplane wing turned vertically. Suddenly, by angling these sails cleverly, you could generate lift. You could sail across the wind, even against it, in a series of zigzags called tacking. This wasn't just an upgrade, it was like swapping your bicycle for a jetpack. The ocean stopped being a one-way street dictated by the wind. You could explore, return, trade. The Austronesians didn't just have this tech, they mastered it, paired it with their incredible double-hulled canoes, and used it to explode across the greatest ocean on Earth. Of course, the wind isn't always cooperative. Enter Plan B. Oars and paddles, muscle power. Forget romantic images of gentle paddling. This was CrossFit, Ancient Mariners Edition. Brutal, relentless, energy-sapping work. Propelling even a moderate-sized boat against wind or current required coordinated back-breaking labour. Shifts, rhythm, endurance. These weren't just skills, they were survival. Forget gym memberships. Survival was the ultimate personal trainer. Feel the burn or drown. Let's not forget the unsung heroes, material science, 40,000 BC, no Home Depot, no titanium alloys, just stone, wood, plants, fire, and astonishing ingenuity. Stone tools sharp enough and durable enough to shape hardwoods. Fire used not just for warmth, but as a precise tool for hollowing, bending, and hardening wood. The engineering of cordage, turning floppy plants into ropes strong enough to hold a boat together in a storm. Waterproofing agents scavenge from the environment. Tar pits, bitumen, tree saps, animal fats, oils, and the intricate knowledge of lashing, knowing how to tie things so they stayed secure under immense strain. This wasn't just building. It was applied physics and chemistry using sticks and rocks. No advanced degrees, no wind tunnels, just generations of hard-won knowledge passed down. Will this not hold? Well, Grandad used it, and he only drowned once, and that was during the Great Squid Incident. So probably. From bundled reeds to hollowed logs, from stitched planks to soaring sails, each innovation was a hard-won battle against physics, materials, and the ocean's indifference. It took millennia. It took countless failures lost to the waves. But step by painstaking step, the impossible became possible. The flimsy coastal crawler evolved into a deep-sea conqueror. They transformed trees and vines into vessels of destiny. They built more than boats. They built horizons. But building the boat was only half the battle. How do you steer this floating patchwork across thousands of miles of trackless blue, without a map, a compass, or even a slightly confused GPS voice? How do you navigate the void? So you've built your floating masterpiece. You've packed the dried fish, still tasting faintly of existential dread. You've kissed the shore goodbye. Now, how do you not die horribly and become fish food? Forget compasses or sextants, and definitely no shouting. Siri, navigate to Hawaii into the void. This was the ultimate test. Navigating a featureless shifting desert of water, where getting lost wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. They didn't have instruments. They became the instrument. The first step was obvious. Don't let go of the pool edge. Coastal crawling, hugging the shore like a nervous swimmer. Learn every bump, every bay, every headland that casts a shadow at noon. Where the freshwater streams muddy the sea, where the seabed shelved gently or dropped away sharply. It was safe, relatively speaking. You knew where you were because you could see where you were. But paradise, or new hunting grounds, rarely lie just around the corner. To reach the truly empty horizons, you had to let go. Venturing beyond sight of land. This wasn't just a physical journey. It was a psychological and intellectual quantum leap. Imagine the courage it took to watch that last smudge of green vanish below the horizon, knowing the next landfall could be weeks away, if you guessed right. This is where navigation transformed from recognizing landmarks to reading the language of the ocean itself. They needed a new map, written in stars, waves, wind, and wings. Celestial GPS, the sky roadmap. At night, the void became a map. Generations of observers memorized the precise paths of stars, not just which stars, but where they rose and set on the horizon relative to known islands. Polaris, the steadfast North Star, became a fixed point for northern travellers. In the south, the Southern Cross and its pointers, along with zenith stars that passed directly overhead specific islands, were crucial. A navigator didn't just see points of light, they saw a moving three-dimensional grid. Steer towards where Oculea, Arcturus, rises until Keikaomakali, Pleiades, clears the horizon. It was astronomy as applied survival, passed down in chants and stories. The ocean's rhythm, reading the waves. The sea isn't chaotic. It has rhythms. Deep ocean swells, generated by distant storms or consistent wind patterns, are like the planet's pulse. A master navigator could feel these swells through the hull of the canoe, sensing their direction and consistency with their body. More importantly, they knew how these swells changed as they interacted with unseen land. An island acts like a rock in a stream, refracting the swells, creating a distinctive detectable pattern, a wave shadow, that could be sensed miles before the island was visible. It was like feeling the echo of a land in the water's dance. Birds, the feathered flight path. Birds were the original signposts. Different species have different ranges. Seeing a frigate bird which can't easily land on water meant land was likely within 50 to 70 miles. But the real stars were birds like terns and noddies. At dawn, they fly out from their island roost to fish. At dusk, they fly straight back home. Spot them heading purposefully out in the morning? Land might be behind you. See them streaming homewards at sunset? Follow them. They were the avian Uber Eats drivers, leading you straight to the takeout counter, also known as dry land and fresh water, much more reliable than a carrier pigeon with questionable motivation. Find land or your dinner. Powerful incentive. Clouds and reflected light. Landscapes in the sky. Land changes the sky. Clouds often pile up over islands due to the heat rising from the land, a stationary beacon in the moving sky. Even more magical was kale, the greenish or whitish light reflected from shallow island lagoons onto the undersides of clouds, visible at dawn or dusk. Spotting that ethereal glow on the horizon could mean salvation. It was seeing land painted on the canvas of the sky, the feel of the sea, listening to the whispers. The ocean speaks in subtle cues. A slight change in water temperature, a hint of different salinity on the tongue, could indicate currents flowing from known lands. The type of seaweed or driftwood floating past told stories of distant shores. Even patterns of bioluminescence at night could offer clues. This wasn't just observation. It was deep sensory integration, learned over a lifetime on the water. The ocean wasn't empty. It was a textured, whispering landscape. Wind and weather lore predicting fury. Knowing when to sail was as crucial as knowing where. Seasoned navigators were meteorologists. They understood seasonal wind shift, the reliable trade winds, the reversing monsoons. They read the sky for signs of approaching storms, mare's tails, cirrus and sinus, a falling barometer, though they sensed pressure changes instinctively, a sudden shift in wind or swell. Setting sail into the teeth of the known storm season wasn't exploration. It was suicide by weather forecast, mental mapping and dead reckoning, the living library. All these clues, stars, waves, birds, clouds, currents, were synthesized into a constantly updated mental map. Dead reckoning. Estimating your position based on your last known point, your heading determined by stars or swell, and your estimated speed, time-travelled feel of the boat. Imagine doing complex vector calculus in your head, while wet, tired, and knowing a mistake means everyone dies. Pacific Islanders took this further, creating physical stick charts, not maps to scale, but models of how wave patterns interacted between islands. And the knowledge? It was stored in chants, epic poems encoding star paths, island sequences, sailing directions, turning points. These weren't campfire songs. They were the sacred, vital operating manuals for survival. The original cloud storage, the human brain, backed up by oral tradition. Prone to the occasional catastrophic system error, but remarkably robust, explaining dead reckoning to the insurance company. So, you guessed? Well, it was a very educated guess based on the flight path of that booby, the taste of the water, the angle of Antares, and the fact Uncle Kanoa swore he saw kale last Tuesday. This was the pinnacle, wayfinding. Not just navigation, but a profound, holistic relationship with the ocean. A true master navigator, Po Kahunaho'okele, didn't just use these signs, he lived them. He integrated every sense, every scrap of knowledge, every whisper of the environment into a continuous dynamic understanding of his place in the vastness. He knew the ocean as a farmer knows his fields. He could hold the image of his target island vividly in his mind, constantly comparing his sensory input to that mental image, adjusting course minutely, instinctively. It was science, art, spirituality, and sheer genius, woven together over generations. They didn't just cross the ocean, they conversed with it. Armed with this staggering, hard-won knowledge, passed down through countless generations of fearless minds, they were ready to cast off not just from the shore, but from the known world itself. ready to point their incredible boats into the greatest emptiness on Earth and find something. The age of the ultimate leap was about to begin. Forget 1492. The real age of exploration kicked off when mammoths were still a parking hazard. Our story begins not with gold-seeking empires, but with desperate families, hungry hunter-gatherers, and the world's first sea monkeys staring down a terrifyingly narrow yet uncrossable stretch of water. The prize, a land of giant lizards and bouncing mammals. Welcome to the Sunda to Sahul Express, departing circa 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. Please mind the gap being several treacherous sea crossings. This wasn't one grand voyage, it was likely a series of daring hops, probably spurred by that rising sea level we talked about nipping at their heels. They faced the Wallace Line, deep ocean trenches that were never dry land. Crossing these meant open water voyages of maybe 50 to 100 kilometres. Doesn't sound like much? Try it in a log with a stone axe and a prayer. This wasn't navigation as we know it. It was likely point towards the big green blob and paddle like hell before the current sweeps you into oblivion. But they made it. They became the first humans to set foot on Australia and New Guinea, tens of millennia before anyone else dared the deep blue. Talk about first mover advantage, even if the neighbours were venomous. Fast forward. While the Pacific slept vast and empty, another cradle of seafaring was buzzing. The Mediterranean, liquid highway of antiquity. By 10,000 BCE, folks were paddling between Cyprus and the mainland. By 3000 BCE, the Minoans of Crete were masters of the wine-dark sea, their elegant ships fostering a vibrant network of trade and culture. Then came the Phoenicians, the undisputed merchant mariners of the ancient world. Think less. Explorers seeking new lands. More Zales reps with really good boats. They didn't just hug the coast. They sailed the length of the Med, founded Carthage, pushed past the Pillars of Hercules, Gibraltar, and maybe even circumnavigated Africa. Thanks, Herodotus, for the intriguing, if uncorroborated, tale. Their secret? Incremental exploration, meticulous coastal mapping, and ships built for commerce and speed. They turned the Med into a superhighway centuries before Rome paved a single road. Trading olives, philosophy, and occasionally bumping into Carthage for a spot of light naval warfare. The original Mediterranean cruise, with slightly higher stakes than sunburn. But hold on to your coconuts, because we're about to witness the most audacious, sustained campaign of exploration in human history. Forget Columbus, forget Magellan. The Austronesians weren't just explorers, they were an oceanic supernova. Originating around Taiwan, armed with revolutionary sewn plank boats, outriggers for stability, double hulls for cargo and families, and the game-changing crab claw sail. They didn't just explore, they colonised half the planet. Meet the Lapita, the Pacific pioneers with a pottery passport. They were the vanguard of the Austronesian expansion into the empty vastness of remote Oceania. How do we know? Their calling card, exquisitely decorated pottery. Finding a Lapita shard on a beach in Fiji is like finding a Starbucks cup on Mars. Undeniable proof someone incredibly intrepid was there. They weren't just sailing, they were moving house. They brought the whole package: domesticated plants, taro, yams, bananas, coconuts, breadfruit, animals, pigs, chickens, rats, ecosystems, tools, and their culture. They were the ultimate homesteaders, turning specks of land into stepping stones across the greatest ocean. Now, witness the conquest of the impossible, the Polynesian Triangle. We're talking voyages that defy belief. Finding Hawaii is like locating a single, specific grain of sand on a beach the size of Texas. blindfolded, in a hurricane. Rapa Nui, Easter Island. It's the most isolated inhabited island on the planet. Reaching it required sailing directly against the prevailing winds and currents for over 1,000 miles. Aotearoa, New Zealand. A massive, cold, stormy landmass lying far to the southwest, requiring navigation across tempestuous latitudes unknown to their tropical ancestors. Distances of 1,500, 2,000, even 2,500 miles of open ocean. No sight of land for weeks, possibly months. Storing enough water, food, battling storms, doldrums, despair. Guided only by the stars, the waves, the birds, the clouds, and the genius of the navigator held in their mind. This wasn't luck. This was the pinnacle of millennia of accumulated knowledge and courage. They didn't just find these islands. They targeted them, guided by stories, star paths, and the subtle signs their ancestors had learned to read in the void. The Austronesian wave is the showstopper, but they weren't alone in pushing boundaries. Early Africans may have ventured far down their coasts. Intriguing whispers hint at possible ancient Atlantic crossings. Though evidence is thin, the idea tantalizes. And in the frozen north, the Inuit perfected the art of surviving and thriving in kayaks and umiaks, amidst ice floes and leviathans, proving human ingenuity blooms even in the harshest seas. Picture those moments, the exhaustion, the disbelief, the overwhelming relief, stepping onto untouched sand, volcanic rock, or lush forest, after weeks or months of nothing but blue. Planting the first breadfruit sapling, naming the new land, realizing the impossible gamble had paid off. These weren't just landfalls, they were the creation of new worlds, the scattering of humanity to the planet's farthest corners. They filled the map not with conquest, but with home. They had crossed the void, they had found their new horizons. But the journey wasn't over when land was sighted. The real challenge began. Surviving on a speck of rock in an immense ocean far from everything they had ever known. Life aboard was hard, but life after arrival, that was a whole new adventure. So they found land. Cue the triumphant music, roll credits. Except, no. Finding land was just the end of Act 2. Surviving the voyage to get there. That was a brutal marathon of discomfort, deprivation, and wondering if the guy snoring like a walrus next to you was worth saving if rations ran low. And actually living on that newly discovered speck of rock. That was Act 3. Survival mode. Island edition. Paradise, it turns out, often needed a lot of work. Supplies, the fine art of not dying. Packing for an open ocean voyage of unknown duration wasn't about snacks, it was about calibrated survival. Water was the golden currency, stored in gourds, pottery, bamboo, precious rationed drops. Collecting rainwater was a life-saving skill. Food was portable calories, dried fish, tasting increasingly like salted cardboard, hard tack made from pounded starches, taro, breadfruit, yam, think dense flavourless energy bricks, fermented pastes, nutritional but an acquired taste, vaguely reminiscent of defeat, maybe some live chickens or pigs for the really long hauls. Fishing en route was crucial but never guaranteed. Forget all you can eat, this was hope you can eat. Survival at sea, the constant battle. Thirst was a relentless stalker. Rations dwindled, storms could ruin collected water. Finding land wasn't just about territory, it was about finding a functioning water source. Scurvy, the scourge of later European sailors, was likely a known terror, though Pacific Islanders had a secret weapon, the humble coconut. Green coconuts provided sterile water and vitamin C. Finding an island with coconuts wasn't just convenient, it was medicinal. But weeks at sea took their toll. Dehydration, sun exposure, salt sores, infections, the gnawing anxiety of dwindling supplies. The "are we there yet" refrain had life or death stakes. Sharing is caring takes on a whole new meaning when caring might mean you get half a bite of something that vaguely resembles fish instead of a quarter. Romance on the high seas, more like, I won't push you overboard if you stop hogging the rainwater gourd. Crew dynamics, the world's most intense team-building exercise. Who were these people? Likely family groups, parents, children, cousins, bound by blood and shared fate. Or perhaps skilled crews led by a revered navigator or chief. Roles were vital: bailer, sail tender, fisher, water watcher, morale officer, unofficial, probably the one who wasn't constantly complaining. Leadership was tested constantly. Decision fatigue was real. Conflict, inevitable. Imagine weeks confined on a damp, heaving platform with the same people, hungry, thirsty, scared. Disputes over space, rations, or just personality clashes could fester. Resolving them wasn't about HR policies. It was about preventing mutiny or someone going overboard, accidentally. Trust, shared purpose, and maybe a shared grim sense of humour were the glue. Landfall. Paradise requires renovation. That first step ashore, sheer unadulterated relief. Then, panic. Finding fresh water was job one. No water. This paradise was a death trap. Immediate food sources were scoured. Seabird colonies ravaged for eggs and chicks. Shellfish gathered frantically. Fish speared. But the real test began with the transported landscape. Those precious shoots of taro, yams, bananas, breadfruit, they had to be planted. Now clearing land with stone tools was backbreaking. Gardens were vulnerable to storms, drought, pests. The carried animals, pigs, chickens, rats, often escaped, becoming both future food sources and ecological disasters. This wasn't kicking back on the beach. It was founding a civilization from scratch, with a starter kit carried in a canoe. Many attempts likely failed. The islands we know were settled with the successes. Farm to table took on a whole new immediacy, more like dig, plant, pray, chase rats, hope to eat before you starve. Forget location, location, location. It was water, food, shelter, and maybe fewer rats. Not every landfall was Eden. Some islands were marginal, barren atolls with thin soil and scarce water. Others proved hostile in ways unseen from the sea. Storms could wipe out nascent gardens. Isolation could become a prison. The skeletal remains and abandoned campsites speak of voyages that found land but not survival. The Pacific graveyard holds more than ships. Against staggering odds, many did succeed. They tapped springs, nurtured gardens, built communities, and forged new lives in incredible isolation. The canoe on the beach wasn't just transport, it was a lifeline to the sea, a reminder of their origins and the vessel that brought their future. They became the seed from which entire cultures grew. The voyage was hell, but the payoff, a chance to build a world. They had survived the sea. They had conquered the shore. Their leap into the blue didn't just change their fate, it changed the genetic, cultural and ecological map of our entire planet. The ripples of those first sea monkeys are still washing over us today. Those first perilous paddles into the unknown weren't just adventures. They were the strokes that painted the final human footprints onto the canvas of our planet. The peopling of the planet reached its last, most audacious chapter on the waves. From Sahul to Rapa Nui, from Madagascar to Hawaii, the oceans ceased to be barriers. They became the highways that carried humanity to every habitable shore. The age of continental wanderings ended. The age of oceanic destiny began. We are all, in some distant way, children of the sea explorers. Forget the Columbian exchange. Meet the Austronesian exchange, the first globalized grocery store. Centuries, even millennia before European sails billowed, the Austronesian seafarers were the world's most prolific bioengineers and distributors. They didn't just carry people, they carried entire ecosystems in their canoes. Taro, yams, bananas, coconuts, breadfruit. These weren't just snacks, they were survival kits, the foundation of sustainable life on remote islands, and they spread them relentlessly. Chickens and pigs hitched rides, becoming global staples. The humble coconut became the ultimate seafaring superfood and the world's first multi-purpose container. This wasn't accidental spillage, it was deliberate transplantation. Finding Pacific crops like the sweet potato in pre-Columbian South America, or chickens in Chile before Columbus, whispers of astonishing ancient contacts, intentional voyages or storm-driven drift that rewrote botanical and zoological maps long before history books took notice. The Polynesians didn't just find islands, they greened them, creating portable landscapes that fed the world. Globalization 1.0. Less just-in-time delivery, more hope it grows in time delivery. The original Amazon Prime took about 500 years, but the subscription was free if you survived the voyage. Foundations for later giants. The daring of those first mariners didn't vanish, it became the bedrock. The Phoenicians mastered Mediterranean trade routes. The Vikings, inheriting northern boat-building prowess, terrorized and explored. The Arabs fused knowledge across the Indian Ocean. The Chinese built leviathans. The Europeans, latecomers to the oceanic game, synthesized it all. But the core principles, hull design, sail technology, celestial navigation concepts, often trace their roots back to those first experiments with logs, reeds, and stars. Columbus didn't invent ocean crossing. He inherited a millennia-old tradition of insane courage built on the backs of forgotten Pacific and Indian Ocean masters. Cultural resilience, the knowledge lives. The most profound legacy isn't in ruins or artifacts, it's in living knowledge. For centuries, the West dismissed Polynesian feats as impossible, attributing their presence to drift voyages or sheer luck. Arrogance blinded them to the genius. Then came the Hokulea in the 1970s. Built using traditional designs, navigated solely by ancient star path, wave reading and bird law methods, it reached Tahiti. It wasn't a replica, it was a resurrection. It proved the ancient chants weren't myth, they were precise nautical manuals. Today, across the Pacific, a renaissance blooms. Children learn the old ways, not as history, but as heritage, as science, as a profound connection to their ancestors in the ocean. The navigator's art, once nearly extinct, sails again. It's a testament. Their genius wasn't luck. It was reproducible science passed down through generations. The human spirit. The horizon endures. Ultimately, the legacy of the first sea explorers is etched not just on maps or in DNA, but in the human psyche. They prove that curiosity, tempered by courage and ingenuity, can conquer the seemingly impossible. They stared into the terrifying trackless void and answered its challenge with nothing but wood, fibre, memory, and an unshakable will to know what's out there. They transformed the unknown into the known, the impassable into the pathway. Their journey is our blueprint. When we launch probes to Mars, when we peer back to the dawn of time with space telescopes, when we dream of stars beyond our own, we're following in the wake of those first fragile rafts and majestic Waiakaulua. The ocean was their cosmos. The stars were their guideposts. They shrank their world, proving that no horizon is truly final. They gifted us not just new lands, but the enduring belief that exploration is not just possible, it is essential to who we are. The sea explorers didn't just become sailors, they became the living proof that the greatest voyages begin with a single audacious question. I wonder what's beyond the waves. So, the next time you stand on a shore, gazing out at that immense shimmering blue, remember, it's easy to see only the vastness, the indifference, the barrier. But look closer. Remember the hands that first lashed reeds and logs together, defying the deep. Remember the minds that mapped the heavens not on parchment, but in memory, turning the star-strewn void into a highway. Remember the courage that pointed fragile prows into trackless immensity, fueled by hunger, curiosity, or simply the desperate hope for a better beach. They didn't have satellites. They were the sensors. They didn't have engines. They had ingenuity, muscle, and the free fuel of the wind, harnessed by sails born of genius. They didn't conquer the sea. They learned its ancient rhythms, respected its terrifying power, and found their place, tiny, audacious specks, within its grandeur. They answered the siren call of the unseen horizon, and in doing so, they shrank our world. They filled its empty corners with life, language, and the stubborn resilience of the human spirit. They proved that the greatest force of exploration isn't technology, though their boats were marvels. It's the spark of curiosity. It's the courage to leap into the unknown, armed with nothing but a sharp mind, a keen eye, and a boat held together by hope and vines. They are the original sea explorers, not just survivors but pioneers, architects of the possible, and their legacy isn't just the islands they found, or the plants they carried, or the stars they followed. It's the enduring belief they gifted us, the belief that no horizon is final, that the next wave, the next star, the next leap into the blue, whether across an ocean or towards the stars, is not just a journey, but the very essence of being human. The ocean beckons, the stars await, the horizon endures, sail on. The ocean has always been a place of mystery, vast, endless, terrifying. To early sailors, the horizon wasn't just far away. It was a line between the known world and something unspeakable. Beyond that blue edge, who could say? Paradise? Doom? Probably both, with a side of bad weather. Now we might think of the sea as something ordinary. We board cruise ships, eat ice cream while watching the waves, and complain about spotty Wi-Fi. But to our ancestors, the ocean was alive. It breathed storms, it whispered in the wind, and worst of all, it hid monsters. Not metaphorical monsters, real ones. Or at least they thought so. You see, the sailors of history weren't just battling storms, hunger and boredom. They were also fighting their own imaginations. Every shadow on the waves, every ripple, every strange sound at night, it could all be explained by something lurking beneath the surface, something massive, something waiting. And when you're months at sea with nothing but hard biscuits for food and the same 7 exhausted faces for company, your mind will happily supply the details. It's in those long, empty voyages that legends were born, of krakens and serpents, of sirens and spirits, of whirlpools and ghost ships. Let's drift into those stories, slowly, calmly, because if history has taught us anything, it's this. When the sea doesn't kill you directly, your imagination will try to finish the job. Of all the monsters said to dwell in the deep, none looms larger, literally, than the kraken. A beast of Norse legend, whispered among Scandinavian sailors for centuries, the kraken was said to be vast. not just large, island-sized. They claimed it could rise from the water and blot out the sun, its tentacles whipping across the waves, dragging ships into whirlpools as it descended back into the deep. Now you might be picturing a giant squid. That's fair. But you need to understand the scale. These stories didn't describe something a few dozen feet long. They described something so huge, sailors might mistake its back for dry land and attempt to land on it. Imagine the disappointment of unpacking your gear, only to realize the island you found is stretching, yawning, and preparing to drown you. Calmly put, the Kraken was less of a creature and more of a natural disaster with tentacles. It's no surprise that these legends came from the north. The waters off Norway and Greenland are wild, deep, dark, and full of strange things. Every so often, sailors might glimpse the curling arm of a squid at the surface, or perhaps they hauled up a giant tentacle tangled in their nets, slick and alien. With no biology textbooks handy, it was easy to fill in the blanks. And really, who could blame them? Even today, the giant squid is a creature shrouded in mystery. It lives in the depths, rarely seen alive. Some can stretch 40 to 50 feet from the tips of their tentacles to the end of their mantle. For context, that's longer than a school bus. Imagine one of those drifting past your fragile wooden boat, and suddenly the Kraken doesn't sound so far-fetched. Of course, sailors weren't content to leave it at big squid. Over time, the Kraken grew in the telling, from large and unsettling to world-ending horror. By the 18th century, naturalists were debating whether it was real, with some suggesting it was simply an undiscovered species of whale. Others insisted on the squid theory. And many sailors, well, they were just happy to have something dramatic to explain why half their fleet didn't come home. After all, it's easier to blame the Kraken than to admit your cousin Lars didn't know how to steer in a storm. The legend of the Kraken became so popular, it crawled out of sailors' tales and into literature. Alfred Tennyson wrote a whole poem about it. Later, Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea gave us a famous squid attack scene clearly inspired by it. And modern movies, of course, can't resist slapping the Kraken onto every pirate ship or Viking longboat they find. But here's the thing. Underneath the exaggeration, there's a grain of truth. Gigantic creatures do live in the deep. Squids the size of houses. Octopuses we've barely studied. And we know almost nothing about what lurks miles below the surface, so the Kraken may not be real in the island-sized Doom Machine sense. But in another sense, well, next time you're on a boat and something brushes the hull, you might want to look twice, and remember, every legend starts somewhere. If the Kraken was the heavyweight champion of sea monsters, then the sea serpent was its lanky, slippery cousin, less dramatic, but no less terrifying to sailors. Stories of enormous snakes coiling through the waves appear in cultures all over the world. The Greeks had them, the Norse had them. Even sailors in China told tales of massive water dragons twisting in and out of the sea foam. In short, wherever humans sailed, they were convinced the ocean was basically one giant reptile enclosure. One of the most famous of these myths comes from Norse legend, the Midgard serpent, also known as Jörmungandr. According to the story, this serpent was so large it encircled the entire world, biting its own tail. You didn't need to be a sailor to know that if something that size showed up under your ship, you were in serious trouble. Other accounts were less grand, but still unnerving. Sailors swore they'd seen snake-like creatures rising out of the sea, their bodies stretching across the waves, their heads rearing up like monstrous cobras ready to strike. Now, before we laugh too hard at them, remember the conditions. Picture this. You're in a creaking wooden boat. Fog rolls in, the horizon disappears, and suddenly you spot something long and silver gliding just beneath the surface. could be a log, could be a fish, could also be the biggest snake the world has ever seen. And because you're hungry, cold, and possibly drunk on cheap ship beer, your brain is happy to pick the scariest option available. Of course, many of these sightings probably had much more reasonable explanations. For one, there's the oarfish, a real creature, stretching up to 30 feet long, with a long ribbon-like body and a fin that runs its entire length. Rarely seen alive, they sometimes wash up on shores after storms. To a frightened sailor, catching a glimpse of an oarfish thrashing in the water would look exactly like a serpent out of myth. Then there are whales. From a distance, the undulating backs of several whales surfacing in a row could look like the coils of a massive snake. Add fog, low visibility, and overactive imagination, and suddenly you've got yourself a monster. Still, the idea of sea serpents was too good to die out. Reports kept coming in even into the 19th century. Newspapers occasionally printed sightings of mysterious snakes seen from ships. Even today, every few years, someone somewhere swears they've spotted a massive eel-like figure cutting through the waves. Are they exaggerations, misidentifications, or is there something in the deep we still haven't discovered? After all, the ocean covers more than 70% of our planet, and we've explored less than 5% of it. That leaves a lot of room for surprises. So maybe the sailors weren't entirely wrong. Maybe the sea does hide serpents, just not the world-wrapping apocalypse snake of legend. But then again, imagine being alone on night watch, the sea stretching dark and endless around you, and something long and sinuous gliding just out of sight beneath the surface. At that moment, logic won't help you much. You'll believe in monsters too. While the sea serpents and krakens were monsters of brute force, sirens and mermaids were creatures of temptation, and frankly, of poor decision-making. The idea of dangerous women luring sailors to their deaths goes back at least to the ancient Greeks. In Homer's Odyssey, the hero Odysseus is warned about the sirens, beautiful voices drifting over the waves, promising knowledge and delight. Of course, it was a trap. Sailors who listened too long would steer their ships straight into the rocks. Odysseus, ever the problem solver, plugged his crew's ears with beeswax. But because he wanted to hear the sirens himself, without the messy business of dying, he had his men tie him to the mast. According to the story, he begged them to release him as they passed, but they held firm, which is just as well, otherwise the Odyssey would have ended several chapters early. Over time, sirens blended with another idea, the mermaid, part human, part fish, sometimes benevolent, more often deadly. Sailors told tales of mermaids sitting on rocks, combing their hair, singing sailors into disaster. Now, here's where the humour writes itself, because many historians think mermaid sightings were actually manatees or dugongs. Picture it. You've been at sea for 6 months. Your diet consists of salted meat, stale bread, and questionable water. You've seen nothing but the same half-dozen scruffy men for company. And then, in the distance, a gentle figure rises from the waves. Smooth skin, long limbs, graceful movement. Is it a beautiful woman? Or is it in fact a 1,000-pound sea cow with whiskers? Well, let's just say that love is blind. And perhaps also very, very desperate. Still, mermaid myths spread across cultures. In Europe, they were omens of shipwrecks. In parts of Africa and the Caribbean, they took on different roles, sometimes benevolent, sometimes vengeful. In Japan, the Ningyo was said to be a fish-like creature whose flesh granted immortality, though catching one brought storms and bad luck. Beneath all these stories is a pattern, sailors projecting human fears and desires onto the sea. Loneliness, longing, the dread of being lured into danger. After all, The ocean didn't just threaten bodies, it threatened minds. Isolation can make you see things that aren't there, hear voices that don't exist. Imagine faces in the foam of the waves. So, were mermaids real? Probably not in the way sailors described, with their pearlescent combs and voices that could shatter a man's resolve on the spot. But in another sense, they were very real, as potent symbols of the profound longing and gnawing temptation that festered on long voyages, as stark warnings about the fatal cost of distraction in a world where one wrong turn meant a watery grave, and as timeless reminders that when you're trapped on a creaking wooden ship for months, with a dwindling supply of grog and sanity, you shouldn't always trust your eyes, or your desperately lonely heart. Because at the end of the day, that beautiful woman waving from the waves might actually just be a sleepy manatee, wondering why you look so excited. Not all sea monsters had eyes or teeth. Some didn't even have bodies. Sometimes the ocean itself was the monster. Take the whirlpool, a swirling funnel of water sucking ships into its centre, dragging them down to the deep. For ancient sailors, a whirlpool wasn't just a natural current, it was a hungry mouth. The Greeks imagined Charybdis, a great whirlpool monster that swallowed vast amounts of water 3 times a day and then spat it back out. Sail too close and you'd be sucked down into her depths. And if Charybdis didn't get you, her neighbour Scylla, the 6-headed rock monster, probably would. A real between a rock and a hard place situation, literally. Further north, Norse sailors spoke of the maelstrom, a whirlpool off the coast of Norway so powerful it could sink entire fleets. In legend, it was said to drag down even whales, spinning them helplessly before crushing them in the depths. And to a sailor in a small wooden boat, that wasn't an exaggeration. Strong tidal currents off the Norwegian coast can be fierce. Add storms, rocks, and bad luck, and suddenly your world is turning upside down. The ocean doesn't need tentacles to kill you, it can do the job all by itself. But of course, humans are storytellers. A whirlpool on its own is frightening. A whirlpool with a name and personality? That's terrifying and memorable. Watch out for that swirling current near the cliffs, doesn't quite stick in the mind. But Charybdis, the great devourer of ships. Now that's a warning people will repeat for generations, and let's be honest. If you're a sailor trying to explain to the families back home why half the fleet never returned, it sounds better to blame a mythical monster than to admit you sailed straight into bad weather. The truth, though, is that whirlpools are real. They're caused by tides, currents, and underwater geography. Most aren't strong enough to sink ships, though a few can be deadly for small boats. Sailors in narrow straits or stormy seas would absolutely have felt the ocean twist beneath them, and when the sea starts spinning, your imagination doesn't need much help. So the whirlpool became the monster, a reminder that the ocean could open beneath you at any moment, not with claws or teeth, but with the quiet pull of water sliding sideways. And really, when the sea itself seems to want you gone, who needs krakens? If the kraken and sea serpents were creatures of flesh, and whirlpools were creatures of water, then ghost ships were creatures of the mind, born from equal parts fog, fear, and the sheer, soul-crushing loneliness of the open ocean. Few things unsettled sailors more than the idea of a ship that sailed without a crew. A vessel drifting silently across the horizon, its sails tattered like a shroud, its deck a vacant stage for a play that had ended in tragedy, yet somehow still moving with a purpose only the sea could understand. The most famous of these legends is the Flying Dutchman. According to sailors' tales, this spectral ship was doomed to wander the seas forever, a punishment for its captain's hubris. a man so arrogant he swore he could round the Cape of Good Hope even if it took him until doomsday. The heavens, unamused by the challenge, took him at his word. If you spotted the Dutchman's ghostly glow, the legend said, it was a cursed omen, a sure sign of storms, disaster, or a death on board your own ship. Sightings of the Flying Dutchman continued well into the 19th and even 20th centuries. Sailors swore they saw a shimmering, impossible vessel in the distance, vanishing into thin air as quickly as it appeared. Some of the most credible accounts came from respectable officers in the British Navy, men not given to flights of fancy. Which just goes to show, even the most disciplined sailor, after months of salt beef and watch duty, is not immune to a good ghost story, especially one the ocean itself seems to be telling. But the Flying Dutchman wasn't sailing alone. The world's sea lanes were a crowded highway for the damned. Sailors from all over the globe whispered of phantom vessels, the Kalush of Chiloé Island, a glowing ship said to carry the souls of the drowned who party eternally, the Palatine Light of Block Island, a burning brigantine that reenacts its bloody wreck every few years, or the ghostly galleons of the Spanish Main, their holds still overflowing with cursed gold, forever trying to outrun the pirates that sent them to the bottom. For men who spent months in dangerous, lonely conditions, the line between reality and imagination was paper thin, and the wind sounded an awful lot like whispering. And of course, there were natural explanations. On the open sea, a complex mirage called a Fata Morgana can make distant ships appear distorted, flipped upside down, floating above the horizon, or glowing with an unearthly light. A perfectly ordinary merchantman miles away could, under the right tricks of light and air, look like a spectral vessel hanging in the sky. A waterlogged derelict, its crew taken by disease or mutiny, could drift for decades, a floating tomb stumbling into the path of living sailors. But rational explanations don't always matter when you're tired, hungry, and half convinced the ocean hates you personally. To a sailor, seeing a ghost ship was more than just a scare. It was terrifyingly symbolic, because it wasn't just about the ship. It was about what it meant. An omen. A warning. Proof that the sea could swallow men whole and send back only their empty, bleached white bones of a ship to mock the living. It was the ultimate maritime horror story. Your own fate, sailing right towards you. Some stories spoke of crews who had angered the gods or committed unspeakable crimes, mutiny, murder, piracy, and were cursed to wander forever, trapped on the very instrument of their sin. Others said ghost ships were the collective souls of drowned sailors, still searching for a home port they would never see again, their eternal weeping lost in the sound of the waves. Either way, the message was clear. The sea remembers, and it does not forgive. And if you think that's all just ancient superstition, remember this. Even in our modern age of radar and satellite phones, real ships are still found drifting without a soul on board. The Mary Celeste, discovered in 1872, was a perfectly seaworthy ship with a table set for a meal and supplies intact. But her crew of 10 had vanished into the Atlantic air. No struggle, no sign of violence, no logical explanation. Just gone. To this day, it remains the world's most famous maritime mystery, a blank cheque for our darkest imaginations to cash. She was a ghost ship made of real wood and real terror. So maybe those old sailors, with their superstitions and their tall tales, weren't so wrong to whisper about ghost ships after all. The stories were a way to make sense of the senseless, to give a name to the formless dread that came with the fog. After all, there's something deeply, primally unsettling about the idea of a vessel adrift in the waves, crewless, aimless, yet still moving, like the sea itself is puppeteering it, carrying it where it pleases, a plaything for a force that doesn't care about our plans or our lives. And if you ever spot one on the horizon, its silhouette wrong against the setting sun, maybe just turn the wheel. Don't sail closer. Some mysteries are best left alone at the bottom of the sea where they belong. Here's the thing about sea monsters. It's easy for us, safe on land, to laugh at them now, to roll our eyes and say, of course there aren't giant serpents in the ocean, or that ghost ship was just a trick of the light. But for ancient sailors, these stories weren't just tales. They were survival tools. The sea was the most dangerous place a human could be. You left behind land, home, family, and stepped into a world that wanted nothing to do with you. Storms, disease, starvation, shipwreck. Even in calm waters, death was never far away. So what do? You give the danger a name. You turned it into a creature, a kraken, a serpent, a ghost ship. Because once the fear has a name, you can talk about it. You can warn your friends. You can make rules. Don't sail too far west, beware the rocks at this strait. Turn back if you see strange lights on the water. Myths weren't just entertainment. They were a way of remembering, a way of teaching, a way of making sense of a world that was impossible to control. And honestly, the myths were usually scarier than the truth, and that was useful. Because if a terrifying story kept you from sailing into dangerous waters, then the story had done its job. Even today we do the same thing. We invent metaphors, legends, even conspiracy theories, because the unknown terrifies us. And it's easier to fight a monster than to stare into the abyss of uncertainty. So yes, sea monsters might not be real in the way sailors once believed, but in a way they were real. They lived in the fears, the warnings, the imaginations of countless sailors. And that was enough to shape human history, exploration and survival. The next time you look out over the ocean, whether it's from the safety of the shore or from the deck of a ship, think about those who came before us. The sailors who stared at the same horizon, who saw shapes in the waves and shadows in the fog, and who whispered about monsters in the dark. To them the sea wasn't just water, it was alive. It had moods, tempers, hungers. It could give life, carrying traders and explorers to new lands, or it could take it away in an instant, dragging ships and men into silence. And maybe they weren't so wrong. Even with satellites, maps and technology, the ocean still hides its secrets. Creatures we've never seen, depths we've never touched, and every so often a ship still vanishes, or a strange carcass washes ashore, and we're reminded, we don't know everything. The kraken, the sea serpent, the whirlpool, the ghost ship, they all served one purpose, to remind us that the sea is bigger than we are, that it always has been, that it always will be. And if you listen closely over the crash of waves and the whistle of wind, maybe you'll hear the ocean's laughter, the laughter of a force too vast, too old, too untamed for us to ever truly conquer. So whether you believe in sea monsters or not, remember this. For every ship that sails, the ocean is still watching, and somewhere, just beyond the horizon, the monsters are still waiting. the sea is vast, silent, unforgiving. And when you're a sailor in the age of sails, out there on wooden planks with storms above and miles of water below, the line between survival and disaster feels razor thin. So what do you cling to? Faith, ritual, little rules to keep the chaos at bay. In other words, superstition. Let's drift through the strange and curious beliefs sailors carried with them, from lucky charms to forbidden words to animals that brought either fortune or doom. For sailors, a ship wasn't just wood and rope, it was alive. It had a soul. That's why naming a ship was serious business. A badly named ship was considered doomed before it ever left harbour, and the launching ceremony, that's where breaking a bottle of wine or champagne against the hull comes from. The idea was to appease the spirits of the sea, almost like baptising the ship. But here's the twist. Renaming a ship after it's been launched, that was a terrible idea. Changing a ship's name was thought to confuse the sea gods, who kept ledgers of every vessel afloat. If you changed the name, the gods might not recognise you. Or worse, they'd cross you off entirely. To this day, some modern sailors refuse to sail on a renamed ship unless a special purging ritual is performed. Words mattered. In fact, sailors often treated words as dangerous. Certain ones were banned outright. The word drown was never to be spoken aboard for obvious reasons. Even the word goodbye was risky. Instead, sailors preferred farewell or good luck. Whistling was especially frowned upon. Whistling, they said, whistled up the wind, which sounds useful, until you remember that too much wind meant storms, so a sailor caught whistling could quickly become unpopular with his shipmates. And then there's bananas. Yes, bananas. Carrying them on board was considered extremely bad luck. Why? Some say it's because banana cargoes spoiled quickly, producing toxic gases in the hold. Others say it's because ships carrying bananas often had to sail fast, making fishing difficult. Either way, no bananas. Animals at sea had meaning too. Cats were prized, not just for chasing rats but as lucky charms. A black cat in particular was considered a protector against storms. Albatrosses, on the other hand, were sacred. Killing one was thought to bring terrible misfortune. This belief became famous through Coleridge's poem The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where the sailor who kills an albatross dooms his crew. Dolphins swimming alongside the ship, a sign of safe passage. Sharks circling nearby, a sign of death on board. Even tiny creatures like swallows or sparrows, if seen far out at sea, were thought to carry the souls of drowned sailors. In a way, the ocean felt populated, not just with fish, but with omens, messages and spirits. Before a voyage began, rituals mattered. One common rule: never set sail on a Friday. Some captains flatly refused to leave port if the calendar read Friday. That day was thought unlucky. Another: step on board with your right foot first. To stumble or step left-footed was a bad omen. Sailors also carried charms, coins with holes, pieces of rope from a previous successful voyage, even tattoos. Anchors and swallows were popular tattoos, not just as decoration, but as symbols of safety and homecoming. And then there were offerings. Sailors sometimes poured a bit of rum into the sea before a journey, a liquid gift for the waves. Storms were terrifying. No wonder they inspired their own rituals. One was the use of a caul, a piece of membrane from a newborn. If a sailor carried it, he was said to be safe from drowning. Believe it or not, cauls were sometimes bought and sold specifically for this purpose. There was also the belief in weather witches. Sailors thought certain people could control storms, either by tying the wind into knots or by summoning calm seas. In northern Europe, knots of rope were even sold in markets. Each knot was said to contain a different wind. Untie one for a breeze, two for a stronger gust, 3 for a gale. Of course, none of this worked. But when you're in a storm, powerless, you reach for anything that might give you control. The sea claimed many lives, so death itself became surrounded by superstition. It was said the ocean never gave back what it took. Bodies lost at sea were thought to drift forever in a watery grave. That's why sailors developed rituals for burials at sea. The sewn-up hammock, weighted at the feet, slipped gently into the waves. But they feared ghosts too. If a sailor wasn't given proper rites, his spirit might linger, bringing bad weather or misfortune. And that's where the bell comes in. Ship's bells were used not only for timekeeping but for calling spirits. Some believed a tolling bell at sea could guide the souls of drowned sailors to rest. To us these stories sound quaint. No whistling, no bananas. Don't kill the albatross. But think of the world sailors lived in. They faced storms they couldn't predict, currents they didn't understand, and illnesses with no cure. Superstition wasn't silly to them. It was a way of making sense of danger, a way of feeling just a little less helpless in the face of the endless shifting sea. And in that way, superstition worked. Not as magic, but as comfort. So the next time you hear someone say, "Don't whistle indoors," or you notice a sailor's anchor tattoo, or you see a black cat cross your path, remember that these little fragments are echoes of a time when the ocean was more mysterious than outer space. And for those who risked everything on its waters, a charm, a word, or a ritual was the difference between fear and hope. Most of the time, when the sea takes something, it doesn't give it back. A storm pulls down a fishing boat and it stays gone. A warship sinks beneath the waves, and only divers or sonar find its bones centuries later. The ocean is greedy like that. It keeps wrecks as trophies. But every now and then, the sea does something stranger. It returns the ship. The vessel drifts back, like a gift, or maybe a warning. Its sails half ripped, its timbers creaking, its cargo still intact. The only thing missing are the people, and that absence, that silence, makes ghost ships some of the most unsettling mysteries in maritime history. Some are legends, some are true, and some blur the line, but all of them remind us that, in the end, the ocean doesn't play by our rules. So, get comfortable. We're not in a hurry. Ghost stories are best told slowly, especially when they involve 300 tons of drifting timber. Let's begin with the most famous of all, the Flying Dutchman. The story starts in the 1600s, with a Dutch captain, Hendrik van der Decken, though depending on the version you read, his name changes, which is fairly typical of seafaring legends. People didn't exactly carry brand identity guides when telling ghost stories in a dockside tavern. Anyway, Captain van der Decken was sailing around the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa, when a storm struck, and he swore an oath. Some versions say he shouted at God. Others say he simply said he'd round the Cape even if it took until Judgment Day. Either way, the message was clear. I'm stubborn and I won't turn back. Now, if there's one thing sailors knew, it's that the ocean doesn't appreciate arrogance. The ship was cursed, condemned to sail forever, never docking, never making it home, always visible on the horizon, glowing faintly, but never reaching shore. Over time, sailors claimed to see it. A phantom ship lit up against the storm, sailing impossibly fast. To witness it was supposed to mean bad luck, which is very sailor-like logic. If something spooky happens, tie it directly to your personal misfortune. Even Prince George of Wales, later King George V, recorded a sighting in 1881, which shows you the legend had real sticking power. Of course, royals also tended to write down every strange cloud they saw, so we should keep perspective. In reality, these sightings were probably mirages, known as a Fata Morgana. Light bends across the sea, and a real ship just beyond the horizon looks ghostly. But if you're tired, wet, and half-starved on salted meat, a science lecture doesn't quite cut it. You'd rather say, "Ah, yes, cursed Dutchman, that makes more sense." Next, let's drift to 1872, the Mary Celeste. Probably the most famous real-life ghost ship. She was an American brigantine, 2 masts, about 100 feet long. She left New York in November, carrying a cargo of industrial alcohol bound for Genoa, Italy. A perfectly normal voyage. On December 4th, 1872, the British brig Dei Gratia spots her. She's under sail, but something is wrong. What they found has become the template for every ghost ship story since. The ship was seaworthy. Its cargo was largely intact. There was 6 months' worth of food and water. The crew's personal belongings and valuables were still in their quarters, but the ship's sole lifeboat was gone. And the crew, the captain, his wife, his little girl, were gone. Vanished. The last log entry was from 10 days prior. It was normal. It was the ordinariness that was so terrifying. It wasn't a scene of chaos. It was a scene of interrupted life. It was as if everyone on board had simply evaporated between one moment and the next. So what happened? This is where the story splits into 1,000 possibilities, each more bizarre than the last. The official inquiry was baffled. They gave the crew of the Dei Gratia a salvage award, but no answers. The truth is probably more mundane, and yet, in its own way, more terrifying. The most likely culprit was the cargo. 1,700 barrels of denatured alcohol. If the barrels had leaked, fumes could have built up. Captain Briggs, fearing an imminent catastrophic explosion, might have given the order to abandon ship immediately. They take to the lifeboat tethered to the Mary Celeste by a line, waiting for the fumes to clear. Then a sudden squall. The line parts, and the Mary Celeste sails away, perfectly intact, while the lifeboat is lost to the sea. They were victims of a safety precaution. It's the ultimate maritime you-had-one-job story. The ship's job was to not explode. The crew's job was to stay on the ship. In the end, the ship did its job a little too well, and the crew, tragically, failed theirs. And so, the legend was cemented. The Mary Celeste became the ghost ship that never was, yet always will be. A perfectly logical tragedy wrapped in a supernatural enigma. It proved you don't need a curse to create a ghost story. All you need is the ocean, a bad decision, and a really good mystery. But for every mystery born of accident, there is a legend born of pure, unadulterated curse. A story so potent it has sailed right out of history and into our nightmares. A story that begins with a foolish boast and ends with an eternity of stormy sailing. Some ghost ships are remembered not for being empty, but for what was left behind. Take the Octavius, supposedly found off Greenland in 1775. According to legend, the entire crew was frozen solid. The captain still sitting at his desk, pen in hand, mid-sentence. It was said the ship had tried to cross the fabled Northwest Passage. Trapped in ice, the crew slowly froze, and the ship drifted for years until rediscovered. Now, whether the story is real is questionable. No records confirm it, but as an image, a frozen crew locked in eternal duty, it's perfect nightmare fuel. Another tale tells of the Jenny, found in Antarctic ice in 1823. The captain's logbook reportedly read, "No food for 71 days. I am the last one alive." Like many ghost ship stories, the details probably grew more dramatic with every retelling. Sailors were excellent storytellers. Facts were optional. Sailors also spoke of phantom lights, strange glowing flickers on ships' masts during storms. Today we know it as Saint Elmo's fire, caused by static electricity. But back then, it was a ghostly signal, a warning, a sign the ship was cursed. Far away in Chilean folklore, there's the story of the Caluche, a ghost ship that appears in fog, glowing with golden light, crewed by the drowned. It's said to vanish as quickly as it arrives, and to see it is to know misfortune is close. And then there are voyages that seem cursed not by ghosts, but by terrible luck. Like Franklin's Arctic expedition of 1845, 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, set out to chart the Northwest Passage. They vanished into ice. Years later, fragments of the story emerged. Men slowly starving, dying of lead poisoning from badly soldered cans, and some resorting to cannibalism. Some called it cursed. But perhaps the real curse was hubris. The Arctic doesn't forgive poor planning or dodgy tinned beef. You might think ghost ships are just old myths, but they're not. Even today, derelict ships still appear. In 2020, a 250-foot cargo ship, abandoned years earlier, washed up in Ireland after drifting across the Atlantic. No crew, just rust, barnacles and mystery. The difference now is that we call them derelict vessels instead of cursed phantoms. But the feeling is the same. Something about a ship without people is deeply unsettling. A machine built for human hands, carrying no one. So why do ghost ship tales endure? Because they embody a sailor's deepest fear, to vanish at sea, nameless and forgotten, with only the waves as your witness. A wreck on the ocean floor is tragedy. A ship returned empty, drifting silently, is something worse. Its absence made visible. And that's why ghost ships remain, century after century. The Dutchman glowing on the horizon, the Mary Celeste, abandoned without a fight. The Octavius, crew frozen at their posts. Real or not, they remind us of one truth. The ocean keeps secrets far longer than we do. And sometimes, if it feels like it gives a secret back. Imagine for a moment that you're standing on the deck of a wooden ship. The sea is calm for now, the horizon stretches endlessly, and you tell yourself, well, at least there are no monsters. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The ocean didn't need monsters. It already had more than enough ways to kill you. We're leaving the krakens, the ghost ships, and the curses behind. Instead, we'll look at the very real, very natural dangers of the sea. The things that don't require imagination, only experience. And unfortunately our ancestors had a lot of that. For centuries sailors spoke of sudden towering walls of water. They were called rogue waves, freak waves, or, in sailor terms, oh no. Imagine sailing under a sky that looks calm enough when suddenly, out of nowhere, a wave the height of a 10-story building slams into your ship. For most of history, these were dismissed as sailors' exaggerations, tall tales told in taverns after too much rum. But in the 20th century, modern instruments finally confirmed what sailors already knew. Rogue waves are real. They rise out of nowhere, not tied to storms, not even predicted by weather patterns. Just a spontaneous wall of moving water, capable of snapping steel ships in half. So, the sailors were right all along, and probably a little annoyed when scientists finally said, "Oh, yeah, actually, turns out the ocean can do that." The sea spinning itself into a watery blender. Whirlpools were terrifying for obvious reasons. You see water pulling downward into a swirling vortex, and if you're in a fragile wooden boat, that's not ideal. One of the most famous was the Moskstraumen, off the coast of Norway. It was so dramatic that it gave us the word maelstrom. Writers like Edgar Allan Poe and Jules Verne even turned it into literature, describing ships being dragged into endless watery pits. In reality, Most whirlpools aren't as cinematic as the stories, but some were strong enough to drag small vessels under. And when you're already worried about storms, disease and pirates, the idea that the sea could just casually spin itself into a ship-sinking spiral wasn't exactly comforting. Of course, nothing was more common or more deadly than storms. A sudden squall could shred sails, snap masts and scatter fleets. Entire navies were lost to weather alone. The Spanish Armada in 1588, half destroyed not by enemy fire but by storms, hurricanes in the Caribbean. They decided the outcomes of battles long before cannons did. Storms could rise fast. One sailor might say, "It's calm, look at the stars," and 10 minutes later they'd be clinging to the side of a ship that was trying very hard to become a submarine. Lightning at sea was another fear. A bolt hitting the mast could set sails ablaze, or worse, travel down into the powder magazine. That's not the kind of fireworks anyone wanted. And if you survived, well, congratulations, you're still soaking wet, freezing cold, and probably hungry. Speaking of hunger, if the ocean didn't kill you quickly, it had a slower weapon: disease. On long voyages, fresh food and clean water ran out quickly. That's when scurvy arrived. The disease caused by vitamin C deficiency. Scurvy didn't kill fast. It made sailors weak, gums bleeding, teeth falling out. Their skin bruised easily, and wounds wouldn't heal. At the height of the age of exploration, scurvy claimed more lives than battles, storms, and shipwrecks combined. There were also fevers, dysentery, and outbreaks of plague. A ship could leave port with a full crew and arrive half empty, not because of enemy cannon fire, but because the ocean was a floating petri dish. Then, of course, there was human error. Navigation was tricky. Before modern charts, sailors relied on stars, crude maps, and a lot of guesswork. One wrong calculation, one cloudy night, and suddenly, crash. You've hit a reef, a sandbank, or a rocky coastline. Shipwrecks were so common that some coastlines became graveyards of wood and bones. Lighthouses eventually helped, but by then countless ships had already been lost to simple geography. And let's not forget fires. A lantern knocked over, or a spark in the gunpowder storage, and suddenly your wooden ship, coated in tar and carrying sails like giant matchsticks, turned into a floating bonfire. So here's the question. If the ocean was this dangerous, why did people keep going back? The answer was simple. Survival. Fishing, trade, exploration, empire building. It all depended on ships. The risks were terrible, but the rewards were too big to ignore. Besides, people have a strange ability to accept danger as normal. After all, today we casually get into cars every day, despite knowing full well how many accidents happen. Sailors did the same with the sea. They feared it. They respected it. But they sailed anyway. So in the end, the real monsters of the ocean weren't krakens or curses. They were walls of water, spirals of current, storms, scurvy, and the simple fact that humans are fragile and the sea is not. But even knowing all of this, sailors still dreamed, and they still told stories, because as terrifying as the sea was, it was also endlessly fascinating. And that leads us to our final episode in this ocean series. We've looked at monsters, ghosts, superstitions, and real dangers, but next we'll go deeper still, into the myths of entire lost worlds swallowed by the sea. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the sea, endless, quiet, unbroken. And then imagine, somewhere beneath those waves lies a city, streets, temples, towers, all swallowed by the ocean, It's an idea that has haunted human imagination for thousands of years. That entire worlds, entire civilizations could vanish beneath the sea, from the legendary Atlantis to forgotten islands in Celtic tales, to drowned cities whispered about along the coasts of India, Japan, and beyond. Not everything we'll talk about is real, but the line between myth and history is often blurrier than you think. We have to start here. Atlantis, the lost city, the gold standard of underwater myths. The story begins with the philosopher Plato, around 360 BCE. In his dialogues, he describes a mighty island empire, rich and powerful, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. According to Plato, Atlantis was advanced in technology, architecture, and wealth. It grew arrogant, sought to conquer others, and in a single night and day of misfortune it was swallowed by the sea. That's the entire origin, just a few paragraphs in Plato's writing. And yet, those words have echoed through centuries, spawning endless speculation. Was Atlantis real? Most historians believe Plato simply invented it as an allegory, a warning about hubris. But that hasn't stopped generations from searching. Some point to Santorini, where a volcanic eruption destroyed the Minoan civilization. Others to Spain, the Azores, or even the Caribbean. The funny thing is, Atlantis may not be real, but our desire for it says a lot. We want to believe there's something hidden, just out of reach, a reminder that civilizations, no matter how mighty, can vanish. Atlantis wasn't the only story of a drowned world. Off the coast of Cornwall in England there's a legend of Lyonesse. It was said to be a fertile kingdom, filled with towns, fields and churches. But one night, the sea rose suddenly and swallowed it whole. Today, sailors in the Isles of Scilly sometimes claim that on calm days you can hear bells ringing beneath the waves, and fishermen speak of pulling up ancient stones in their nets. Geologists know that sea levels did rise dramatically after the last ice age. It's entirely possible that fertile land once connected Cornwall to the Scilly Isles, and that it really was lost beneath the sea. So here, unlike Atlantis, the myth may have some roots in truth. Not an empire of advanced technology, but farmland, villages and ordinary lives washed away. Across the Channel, in Brittany, France, lies another legend, the city of Yez. Yez was said to be the most beautiful city in the world, built below sea level, protected by giant sea walls. But the city had one weakness, a single gate, which kept the ocean out. The story goes that the king's daughter, Dahut, stole the keys to the gate during a festival, opened it, and the ocean rushed in, drowning the city. To this day, Bretons say that when storms rise you can hear the church bells of Wis ringing beneath the waves. Was it true? Probably not. But coastal flooding is common in Brittany, and the story of Wis may simply be a poetic explanation for disasters people could not otherwise explain. Now let's travel to India. In the state of Gujarat lies the modern city of Dwarka. But Hindu tradition speaks of an older, mythical Dwarka, a city ruled by Krishna himself. It was described as a golden city, with palaces, gardens and temples, and after his death the sea claimed it. For centuries it was thought to be only legend. But in the early 2000s, marine archaeologists discovered ruins off the coast of Gujarat. Stone walls, streets and artifacts dating back thousands of years. Is it the Dwarka of legend? That's debated. But here, unlike Atlantis, we do have actual underwater ruins, proof that whole cities really can be lost beneath the sea. In 1986, off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan, divers discovered something strange. Huge stone formations, steps, terraces, and flat platforms that looked eerily like architecture. Were they natural formations, or the remains of a lost city? Geologists argue both ways. Some say the structures are carved by currents and erosion. Others insist the angles are too precise, too deliberate. To this day, the Yonaguni Monument remains one of the most debated underwater sites. Natural wonder, or the ruins of a forgotten civilization? Either way, it shows how eager we are to see traces of ourselves in the deep. Here's the thing. Legends of lost lands are everywhere. In Wales, there's Cantra Gwaelod, another kingdom said to lie beneath the sea. In Portugal, sailors told of the Ilha de Sete Cidades, an island that appeared and vanished. In Scandinavia, whole coastlines were said to have sunk in ancient floods. Why so many similar stories? Because sea levels really did rise dramatically after the Ice Age. Over 400 feet in just a few thousand years. Vast areas of land were swallowed. Doggerland, for example, once connected Britain to mainland Europe. Today it's entirely underwater, so when people told stories of drowned kingdoms, they weren't just making things up. They were remembering something real. So what do we make of it? Atlantis may be a fable, Uz may be a morality tale, but Dwarka, Yonaguni, Doggerland, those remind us that the line between myth and memory isn't always clear. The ocean is a keeper of secrets. It erases, it buries, but it also preserves. Beneath the waves, there may be ruins we haven't yet discovered. Fragments of lives, of cities, of worlds once thought eternal. And maybe that's why these myths endure. Because somewhere deep down we know they're not entirely wrong. The sea does take, it always has. And so the surface closes over the stories once more. The ghosts fade back into the mist, and the lost city returns to its silent watch in the deep. If you made it all the way here, to this quiet shore at the end of our voyage, thank you. Seriously, thanks for following this journey into the depths with me. So until we cast off on our next adventure, be gentle with yourself out there. Be patient with the uncharted waters of your own mind, and remember, you don't need to find a lost city to discover something profound. The peace you're seeking is like a still ocean on a windless night. It's already there, beneath the surface chop of your thoughts, beneath the riptide of worries, beneath the stormy noise. It's always been there, waiting for you to return to your own anchor. For now, good night, rest well, and let yourself be held by this moment, by the rhythm of your own breath, by the simple, incredible gift of being here, on the shore, alive. If you're hungry for more mysteries from the deep, don't be a stranger. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next voyage. We've only just begun to chart these waters,